Hi everyone. I'm making this video as a response to climate change deniers who say that carbon dioxide is plant food and that the earth is greening due to our emissions and therefore releasing CO2 into the atmosphere isn't a problem and we shouldn't attempt to curb our carbon emissions. I'll start off first by saying both of these premises are true. Increased CO2 does lead to more plant growth and the planet is getting greener due to our emissions. But as I will show, the conclusion that we shouldn't curb our emissions does not follow, and solely focusing on these two positive aspects ignores a whole host of negative features related to CO2 emissions and climate change. So, a little science. Plants use energy from the sun to combine carbon dioxide and water to produce sugar molecules, which they use as food in the process of photosynthesis. They release oxygen as a byproduct while doing this. This process is essential for life on the planet, as this is where we get our oxygen from land and sea plants. When there is more CO2 in the air, plants produce more sugar molecules and they grow bigger. And many farmers who work in greenhouses use generators to raise the CO2 levels inside their greenhouses. They get bigger, healthier plants because of this. But it is important to note that they do this in greenhouses, where conditions can be closely monitored and controlled. In April of last year, 2017, atmospheric CO2 concentrations surpassed 410 parts per million for the first time in at least 800,000 years. And since we started taking samples directly from the air at the Mauna Loa Atmospheric Observatory in Hawaii in 1958, we have seen almost 100 parts per million rise in atmospheric CO2 levels. That is a huge rise in a relatively short period of time. And given that we know increasing CO2 in the air in greenhouses leads to more plant growth, shouldn't we see some sort of reaction around the planet as well? The answer is yes. Here's a paper published recently in the journal Nature Climate Change titled Greening of the Earth and Its Drivers, where scientists studied satellite data over the last 33 years to show that the planet has indeed gotten much greener due to rising carbon dioxide levels. They showed that the extra plant growth was equivalent to adding a green continent about twice the size of the United States, around 6.95 million square miles. The satellite data showed a persistent and widespread increase of growing season greening over 25 to 50% of the global vegetated area, and also that CO2 fertilization from human emissions was responsible for 70% of this increased greening. It's important to note that CO2 levels are still rising, despite all this extra vegetation. But climate change deniers like Rupert Murdoch are correct when they say that the world is growing greener with increased carbon. But the conclusion they draw that we should not reduce our CO2 emissions does not follow, as I will now show. While CO2 may increase the yield of many plants, the effects on nutritional value are actually the opposite. Studies show that plants grown under elevated CO2 conditions have reduced levels of important minerals such as iron, zinc, calcium, and potassium. This occurred in plants that use what's known as the C3 carbon fixation process. These so-called C3 plants include the ones that we eat, such as wheat, rice, soybeans, peas, and potatoes, among many others. These are staple crops that billions of people depend on. Here's a study published in the journal Nature titled Increasing CO2 Threatens Human Nutrition. And these researchers showed that grains and legumes have significantly lower concentrations of zinc and iron when grown under elevated CO2 conditions. And this is a big problem because an estimated 2 billion people suffer from iron and zinc deficiencies worldwide, and it kills 63 million people a year. Elevated CO2 levels were also shown to drive down the protein content of many crops, in some cases significantly. A recent study also in the journal Nature showed that 150 million people could be at risk of protein deficiency by 2050, and that more than 1 billion mothers and 350 million children live in areas where dietary iron content is projected to drop significantly. So, rising CO2 levels may increase the quantity of some crops, but it actually reduces the quality. And I will post links to these studies in the description. Here is a study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences titled Insects Take Bigger Bite Out of Plants in a Warmer, Higher Carbon Dioxide World. And what these scientists showed is that insects that eat plants thrive in warmer temperatures because they grow and reproduce faster and more successfully. They also showed that because plants will have less nitrogen in their leaves due to increased carbon content, insects actually will accelerate their food intake to compensate for this reduction. So they will eat more of the plant in order to get the nutrients that they need. They also found that growth under elevated CO2 levels compromises the ability of soybean and other plants to produce defensive proteinase inhibitors that defend against pests. Also, many common weeds are going to become much stronger with increased CO2 levels, and recent studies have shown that both herbicides and pesticides become less effective as temperatures rise. So farmers are going to have to increase the use of these chemicals, which could have toxic effects for both them and their consumers. Another big problem with increasing temperatures is that it allows plant pests and diseases to extend their territory and move into areas where it was previously too cold for them to survive. Here we have a study from the journal Nature Climate Change titled Crop Pests and Pathogens Move Polewards in a Warming World, and it showed that crop pests, such as corn rootworms and the fungus clubroot, are moving towards the poles at an average of 2.7 kilometers per year. An estimated 10 to 16% of global food harvests are lost to plant pests and pathogens every year. So this is a serious problem. As we have seen, increasing carbon dioxide in the air can lead to higher crop yields, but in order to realize those yields, other conditions must be met, such as nutrient levels, soil moisture, water availability, and importantly, temperature. These things are all relatively easy to control inside of a greenhouse, but the planet's atmosphere is an entirely different story. And climate change threatens the conditions that are favorable for crop growth in numerous ways. Extreme heat can damage crops, reduce yields, and even totally destroy them. And rising atmospheric temperatures are one of the direct results of increased CO2 levels, as carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. Here is a study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, which showed that the temperature increases that are expected with climate change will reduce yields of wheat, rice, maize, and soybean crops around the globe. Together, these crops provide 2/3 of humanity's caloric intake, so any reduction in their yield has extremely serious implications. Changes in precipitation patterns are one of the chief ways that climate change will manifest, and this generally means there will be more flash flooding in wet regions and longer and more severe drought in dry regions. California is currently facing historically low precipitation rates and snowpack levels, and a study published in February of 2018 by the University of California titled Climate Change Trends and Impacts on California Agriculture examined the effects of events like droughts, flash floods, pests, and diseases on crop yields over time. It found that nearly every crop will face diminishing yields over the coming decades, and by the end of the century, the climate in California will simply no longer be able to support many of the state's major crops. California's agriculture is worth over $50 billion a year, and it supplies much of the nation's fruits and vegetables. The study's authors warn that disruptions in food production there could translate into national food security issues, as well as financial crisis. In 2017, natural disasters cost the United States agricultural business over $5 billion. Everywhere in the country and the world, farmers are feeling the negative impacts of climate change. Those who suggest that rising CO2 levels will be some sort of boon to agriculture are really ignoring a whole mountain of evidence that points to the contrary. I'll post the links to all of these studies in the description. There are many other negative aspects of climate change not related to crop production that cannot be ignored. I won't go into much detail on these for this essay, but obviously the melting of the polar ice caps and the resulting sea level rise is important. Rising sea levels could lead to 2 billion climate refugees by 2100. And studies show that rising temperatures and reduction in fresh water lead to more violent conflict. So you can imagine with all the civil unrest in the world today, things getting much worse as temperatures rise and fresh water supplies run out. The oceans, as the planet's largest carbon sinks, are acidifying. This is threatening numerous small species such as zooplankton and coral reefs, which are currently facing a global bleaching crisis. Around the planet, natural ecosystems are under threat and collapsing, and we are experiencing a huge loss in biodiversity as species go extinct. A recent study by the World Wildlife Fund found that half of all species in the planet's most wildlife-rich environments will face extinction by 2100. Extreme weather events like heat waves, hurricanes, tornadoes, winter storms, wildfires, floods, and landslides are all becoming more common, and these all have human cost. They result in deaths. Reduced air quality due to increased ground-level ozone production and particulate matter in the air harm asthma and allergy patients. And vector-borne diseases are becoming more widespread as insects are now able to expand their territories. All these negative aspects of climate change are expensive, and a recent study titled "The Economic Case for Climate Action in the United States" found that the economic losses from weather events and health damages due to air pollution caused by fossil fuel energy production currently cost the United States $240 billion a year, and by the next decade those expenses will grow to $360 billion a year. Often there is an economic excuse given for not taking action on climate change, because to do so would be too expensive or it would cost jobs. But the costs for not taking action are already huge, and they will continue to grow exponentially if we do not do anything. So in conclusion, yes, the planet is greener and CO2 can be considered plant food, as it can lead to higher crop yields under certain controlled conditions. But Earth's atmosphere is not controllable, and the many negative effects climate change has on food production, such as flooding, drought, heat waves, plant pests, and pathogens, lead to crop losses that more than outweigh any gains the higher CO2 levels may have given. In addition, higher CO2 levels actually lowers the nutritional quality of many staple crops by reducing key mineral concentrations and protein content. Also, research shows that plants adapt to the rising CO2 levels, so the greening effect that we have seen will likely not continue into the future, and in fact it may already be reversing. And those like Rupert Murdoch, who say that the planet is greener thanks to our CO2 emissions, conveniently forget to mention the many negative aspects of climate change. They focus only on a couple data points that they like and ignore the mountain of evidence that is against their position. Here is a quote from a co-author of the Greening of the Earth study that is used by Murdoch and the like. He was asked about climate change deniers using his study to support their argument. And to that he says, quote, "The fallacy of the contrarian argument is twofold. First, the many negative aspects of climate change, namely global warming, rising sea levels, melting glaciers and sea ice, more severe tropical storms, etc., are not acknowledged. Second, studies have shown that plants acclimatize or adjust to rising CO2 concentration, and the fertilization effect diminishes over time." End quote. So, the next time you hear someone say the planet is getting greener and carbon dioxide is plant food, you can tell them yes, they are correct, but to solely focus on those 2 points is to ignore the big picture. The reality is climate change not only threatens global food supply and nutrition in numerous ways, it threatens our very existence. Thank you. Please share this video.